What if the place you thought would bring you peace turned into your worst nightmare? What if your new home, your dream, was suddenly under siege by someone with all the power in the world? This is the story of how I went from being the new neighbor to the community's biggest target, and how I fought back. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. In the spring of 2025, I moved into what I thought would be my sanctuary. My name's Evan, and this house, this modern, clean-lined beauty, was my reward after a decade of grinding. I gave up birthdays, weekends, and comfort, all for this moment. My own place in a neighborhood marketed as quiet, charming, and full of friendly smiles. Turns out quiet doesn't always mean peaceful. I hadn't even finished unpacking when reality slapped me in the face. A white envelope, perfectly centered on my front door, screamed in bold letters, "HOA violation notice." For a second I froze. Maybe it was a welcome packet. A neighborly hello. I opened it. My stomach sank. "Dear resident, you are currently in violation of several community guidelines. Please remove any non-conforming furniture from your front porch. Ensure all visible items meet aesthetic standards. Failure to comply will result in further action. The HOA board." I stared at it in disbelief. I'd been here less than 12 hours. I turned toward my porch. There it was. The offending item, a sleek, matte black lounge chair, tasteful, subtle. It matched the door and trim. No clutter, no chaos. Then I saw her. Across the street, arms folded like a commander before battle, stood Karen. Her expression was pure judgment, the kind that drips with imagined authority. I raised a hand. "Morning." She didn't respond. Instead, she stormed across the street like she owned it. "That chair needs to go," she barked, pointing like she was identifying a crime scene. "Excuse me?" "It violates neighborhood aesthetics," she snapped, eyes narrowing. And frankly, we were never informed of a new tenant. There it was. She didn't think I belonged here. She assumed I was temporary, replaceable. I should have corrected her. But instead I smiled. "Maybe the owner didn't think it was necessary to tell you," I said coolly. Her lips curled in triumph. "Well then," she said, voice soaked in smugness, "I'm afraid we may need to begin the removal process." I stared at her, half stunned, half amused. She had no idea who she was talking to. Not yet. I could have laughed right then and there. The audacity was almost impressive. Karen standing on my property, trying to flex her imaginary authority, like she was the sheriff of some HOA-wrapped Wild West. She crossed her arms, eyebrows raised, waiting for me to crumble. I didn't. Instead, I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out my house keys, silver, engraved unmistakably mine. I let them dangle from my fingers with just enough flair to make a point. "That's good to know," I said, stepping closer. "Because I'm not a tenant, Karen." Her eyes narrowed. "I'm the owner." Everything about her expression collapsed. The confident smirk vanished. Her jaw slackened just a bit before she caught herself, pulling together the world's fakest smile, like a mask she'd forgotten was slipping. "You bought this house?" she asked, voice cracking like thin glass. "Paid in full." "Closed last month." Karen blinked. She looked like someone had unplugged her from the control panel. And then, as if she hadn't just tried to evict me from my own home, she flipped her entire demeanor in one breath. "Well," she said with exaggerated cheer, "welcome to the neighborhood. I'm the HOA president, so if you need anything at all." I didn't let her finish. "Good to know," I replied coolly, stepping back and closing my front door gently but firmly in her face. Inside, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That was tense, but also telling. Karen had built her kingdom on the assumption that no one would challenge her. She thought she could intimidate, manipulate, and steamroll anyone new. It worked until now. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, taped to my mailbox, was another violation notice. This time it was about my porch light, the day after my trash bins. Then a complaint about my car parked in my own driveway. Karen wasn't done. She couldn't evict me. So she was trying a different tactic, chipping away slowly, methodically. Make me uncomfortable, make me question if I belonged here. But what Karen didn't know was that this house was just the beginning. And I was just getting started. At first I tried to shrug it off. The violation notices kept coming every morning. A new one, like some twisted HOA advent calendar. Monday was the porch light. Tuesday, trash bins visible from the street for an extra 30 minutes. Wednesday, my car parked neatly in my driveway. According to Karen, I was single-handedly destroying the aesthetic integrity of the entire block. It would have been comical if it wasn't so exhausting. Each letter was typed, printed, and signed the HOA board, but we both knew who was behind them. Karen's vendetta was as clear as the Florida sunshine. One afternoon, as I stood by my mailbox holding the 4th notice in 5 days, I heard footsteps. It was Simon, my neighbor 2 houses down. He strolled over, coffee in hand, that mischievous grin on his face, like he'd been watching the world's juiciest drama unfold. "You really pissed off Queen Karen," he said, nodding toward the paper in my hand. I raised an eyebrow. "Is she always like this?" "Oh yeah," he chuckled. "Only difference is, you actually stood your ground. Most folks just fold." I didn't reply right away. I looked back at the house. My house, and felt that tight knot in my chest twist a little deeper. I didn't buy this place to be pushed around. I bought it for peace, for stability, for a fresh start. "She tried to evict me," I said softly, still a bit stunned by the absurdity of it all. Simon nearly choked on his coffee. "Seriously?" "She assumed I was renting. I told her I was the owner and she flipped." Simon whistled, shaking his head. "She doesn't know, does she?" I looked at him, then gave a slow, deliberate smile. "Not yet." Because Karen had made one dangerous assumption too many. She thought I was a nobody, just some guy lucky enough to move in. What she didn't know was that I didn't just own this house. I owned 9 others. Across this neighborhood. Karen had declared war, but she was about to learn. I don't lose them. By the end of the week, I had collected 6 violation notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. One even claimed my mailbox was too modern and didn't blend with the community's historical tone. Historical? The entire neighborhood had been built in 2014. It was no longer passive-aggressive. It was a full-blown campaign. Karen wasn't just trying to make a point. She was trying to wear me down, force me out, slowly erode my peace of mind with every absurd accusation. But what she didn't know. I don't rattle easy, so I called the bluff. That Monday, I walked into the HOA building for the first time. Legal folder in hand, heart steady. The conference room smelled like overbrewed coffee and cheap vinyl chairs. Karen was already seated at the head of the long table, her arms folded neatly, a thick stack of papers in front of her, like she was preparing for trial. The other board members were there. Too. Greg, the vice president, barely looked up when I entered. Riley, a younger board member, raised an eyebrow. Patty sat to the side, lips pursed like she had just bitten into a lemon. Karen looked up, her voice syrupy sweet. "Evan, glad you could join us. I trust you've received our notices." I nodded, every single one. "It's starting to feel like a subscription service." A tense chuckle came from Riley, quickly stifled. Karen cleared her throat and launched into a presentation so dramatic I half expected a PowerPoint. She accused me of visual negligence, package hoarding, and intentional aesthetic disruption. I waited, calm. Then I opened my folder. "Actually, I think we need to talk about your violations." Karen blinked. I laid out photos, her trash bins left out overnight, her car illegally parked on multiple occasions, an unapproved patio expansion built without permits. Greg finally looked up. "Karen, is this true?" She stammered. "That's irrelevant." "Not according to the rules," I said, voice low, controlled. "You've been enforcing standards you don't follow." For a moment, silence. Then Greg sighed. "Case dismissed." Karen's jaw clenched. Her world, her control was slipping. I stood to leave, locking eyes with her. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. She'd be back. And she'd be angrier than ever. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. No more notices taped to my door. No angry stares from across the street. No clipped footsteps echoing from Karen's porch at 6 a.m. For a moment, I let myself believe she had finally backed off. That maybe, just maybe, our little courtroom showdown had been enough to knock the wind out of her sails. I was wrong. On Friday morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. Unmarked envelope. Thick paper, no logo. That was the first red flag. I opened it, expecting another violation. Instead, I found something far worse. An eviction notice, signed by the HOA board. It claimed I was being removed due to persistent disruption of community harmony and failure to comply with homeowner standards. There was a deadline, a final date to vacate my own home. I stood there for a long moment, letter in hand, stunned. Then I laughed. Not a joyful laugh, one of disbelief, one of pure, "What the hell is this?" Simon, who just happened to be walking his dog at that exact moment, caught sight of me and jogged over. "Don't tell me she actually did it." I held up the letter. "Oh, she did it." Simon's eyes widened. "That's not even legal. The HOA doesn't own property. They can't evict anyone, especially not a homeowner." "I know," I said, "but she's banking on fear. Most people wouldn't question it." "But you're not most people." I looked at him, my grin slowly returning. "Exactly." That afternoon I called Layla, my lawyer. Sharp as a blade and twice as quick. She didn't even pause. "This is textbook HOA overreach," she said. "Not only is it unenforceable, but if she pushed this through without board approval, it's fraud." I leaned back, letting her words settle. Fraud. Karen had finally crossed the line from nuisance to criminal. But instead of reacting, I waited. I wanted her to think she'd won, that her letter had worked. I wanted her smug enough to celebrate, and she did. The next morning, Karen was out watering her lawn, humming, practically glowing. She waved at passing neighbors like she was running for office. I watched from my window. She thought this was over. She had no idea it was just beginning. I gave it 48 hours, long enough for Karen to marinate in her imagined victory, to believe her plan had worked. She strutted around like a monarch restored, smiling wider, walking taller, practically beaming with self-satisfaction. She even stopped Simon mid-walk to compliment his landscaping. That's how I knew she thought she'd won. Perfect. That Monday, I requested an emergency HOA meeting, but this time I wasn't coming as a troubled resident. I was coming as a property owner, one with leverage. Karen was already seated when I walked in. Same seat, same smug smile. This time, she didn't even bother to mask it. "I'm surprised you even showed up," she said sweetly. "We assumed you'd be packing by now." I dropped a thick folder of documents onto the table with a satisfying thud. Her smile faltered. "Actually, I'm here to discuss the future of this community," I said, calm but sharp. She scoffed. "There's nothing to discuss. The board already issued an eviction." I slid the first document across the table. "A fraudulent one," I replied. Silence. Greg, the vice president, leaned forward. "Fraudulent?" I nodded. This letter wasn't processed legally. It bypassed the board. It carries no authority. And worse, it exposes the HOA to liability. I watched Karen's face shift. Her posture stiffened. Her fingers clenched slightly. "And here," I continued, pulling out a cease and desist letter from Layla, "is a legal warning. One more move like this, and Karen, not the HOA, will be facing a personal lawsuit." Patty gasped. Riley's eyes widened. Karen tried to regain her footing. "This is absurd. He's just a homeowner." I smiled. Time for the final card. "Correction. I'm a homeowner who owns 10 properties in this neighborhood." That landed like thunder. I reviewed the bylaws. That means I hold over 10% voting power, more than enough to call a motion. Greg slowly turned. "Is that true?" I placed a final page in front of them. "I'd like to make a motion, a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president." Karen stood up, voice shaking. "You can't." "Actually," Greg cut in, "he can." The vote was swift. Karen was removed. Just like that. She stood frozen, eyes darting, desperate for a way to claw back control. But there was none. That night, Simon texted me a photo, a for sale sign in Karen's yard. And just one word beneath it: victory. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood felt calm. With Karen officially removed from the HOA, the air seemed lighter. Children played without being scolded. Neighbors began to wave instead of whisper. Even the garden beds outside Simon's place bloomed brighter, as if relieved by the shift in energy. A new HOA president was elected, Riley, young, thoughtful and surprisingly fair. At the first community meeting under his lead, he opened by saying, "We don't manage people, we support neighbors." The room erupted in quiet applause. Karen, on the other hand, disappeared. Not in the literal sense. Her car was still parked in the driveway, and the "for sale" sign still stood on her lawn, but the Karen who once patrolled the streets like a general had gone radio silent. No more letters. No more passive-aggressive suggestions. Just absence. It felt over, but a part of me stayed alert. Watchful, I'd seen how power-hungry people operate. They don't go quietly. They recalibrate. And 1 week later, my instincts proved right. A letter arrived. This time not from the HOA. It was anonymous. Unmarked envelope, handwritten. "This isn't over. Some of us still remember what this community was before you came in and poisoned it. Watch yourself." No signature, no return address. I read it twice, then a third time, and laughed quietly, bitterly. Not out of fear, but because I realized something important. Karen wasn't the problem. She was the symptom of something deeper. A mindset, a hunger for control masked as preservation. She may have been dethroned, but her influence might still linger. I showed the letter to Riley. He took it seriously, promised to investigate and reassure the board, but I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about one house anymore. I still owned 10 properties here. I had a voice, a presence, and now I had a mission to protect the peace I'd fought for, to make sure no one, no matter how quiet, how anonymous, ever made someone feel small again. Because sometimes the real war begins after the battle is won. The anonymous letter had stirred something in me, but not fear. Resolve. If there were remnants of Karen's influence still lurking, I wouldn't just wait for them to strike. I'd bring them into the light. With Riley's support, I proposed a bold plan, a complete audit of HOA leadership records, past violations, complaint processing, board votes, everything. Transparency. The kind Karen never allowed. To my surprise, the board agreed. And what we found? Shocking. Dozens of old violations filed with no proof. Fines charged to elderly homeowners with no hearing. Complaints disappeared if they came from those Karen liked. Even Margot, sweet, elderly Margot, had been fined 3 times for having potted plants that were too cheerful. The community had been manipulated, not just intimidated. We brought it all to a town hall meeting. Packed room, standing room only. Neighbors I'd never even met showed up. Some silent, some angry, some just relieved. Riley stepped up first. "None of us knew how deep it went," he said. "But we do now, and it ends here." What followed was nothing short of cathartic. People shared stories, laughed, cried. Even Simon, usually full of snark, stood up and simply said, "I thought I hated this place. Turns out, I just hated what it became under fear." We held a vote to reform the HOA charter, limit presidential power, ensure democratic oversight, and create a community advocate role. I nominated Gina, the young mother Karen once tried to fine because her daughter had chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Gina cried when she accepted, and just like that, something changed. Not just on paper, but in the air. People began organizing garden walks, sharing tools, helping each other repaint fences. Riley launched a digital newsletter titled The Real HOA, featuring neighbor spotlights, local events, even a Karen-free corner with jokes and gentle reminders of how far we'd come. As for Karen, she moved out quietly. No farewell, no confrontation. One morning, her house stood empty. No car, no curtains, just silence. Simon passed by later that day and muttered, "For someone who liked control, she sure vanished fast." I didn't respond. I just looked at the quiet house and nodded once. Not in victory, but in closure, because this wasn't about taking power. It was about giving it back to the people who never should have lost it. And for the first time since I stepped into this neighborhood, I felt exactly what I dreamed of when I bought that house. If this story made you feel something, anger, triumph, hope, or just that sweet taste of justice, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with someone who's ever had to stand up to a bully. Because around here we don't just tell stories, we reclaim them.